Hey guys, in this video we're going to be talking about CSS and looking at some different methods that we can use to start adding styles to our web page. This particular document that I'm showing here is a resource that's listed under your required reading on the lesson content and learning activities page, so I encourage you to refer back to it. But you'll notice in this very top here, it illustrates the basic structure of what's called a CSS rule. And it includes two major parts. We have the selector, which really identifies what element, what content that we are targeting on for our style, and then the declaration includes a property and a property value. So the property is just really identifies the style property that's being adjusted. So in this case it's font size, but another example would be color, which is the font color as opposed to what you might think with font color. But just by typing in that property name, it identifies what we're trying to adjust. And so then the value sets the value for that particular property. So in this case, it's the font size that we're adjusting. And then the value for that is 1.2 em, which if you're not familiar with em, that's fine. It's a unit of measurement. Other examples are pixels or percentages, and we'll look more at that. But at this point, we're just kind of concentrating on the basics. And you'll notice that the declaration includes the property and the property value, and then they're nested between an opening and a closing curly brace. And so these are really important. If you don't use this exact syntax, your CSS will not be applied and you'll find yourself pulling your hair out wondering why. So just always make sure that after your property you use a colon, after your property value you use a semicolon, you wrap everything in curly braces, and then you look at how you're selecting or what selector you're using. And we'll talk more about that. But for the example, I have a basic web page set up here. I have this, my directory open up in Visual Studio Code. You can see my files over here on the left. If we were to look at how that looks in my File Explorer, I have a Module 3 folder to organize my content, and then it's the CSS_examples web directory. If we click inside that, you see everything that you see here. So that's what I have opened up inside Visual Studio Code. And I have a basic index page here, HTML page, and an about page. From the front you can see we really don't have any styles. The only styles that are being brought in here so far is what comes in by default by the type of element that we use. So let's talk about the different ways that we can start using CSS. And so you'll notice up here at the top I have comments. There's 4 different types that I'm going to talk about, but I'm really going to just concentrate on the 2 main ones that you're going to be using in the book, and then I'm going to harp on the best practices, and I'll talk about that momentarily. But the first one we're going to look at or apply a style to is called the embed or embedded CSS method. And so what we're doing for embed is you actually add the CSS rules on your HTML file. And this kind of illustrates why you wouldn't want to, this isn't the best practice, and it's because you don't want to, if we were to add in all of our CSS code with our HTML page, it can become unorganized, it's a lot of code, and you mix your presentation, which is the CSS styles, with your structure, which is the HTML. We're using HTML to structure our page. If we look at the structure of this page, we are establishing the anatomy of our web page and the structure. We have a header here, we have a main content area that wraps other content, and then we have a footer at the end that establishes the content you'd normally see in a footer. So again, right now this looks like a pretty basic page. It's not very well styled, but the structure is good. And so let's talk specifically about that, or let's look at an embed method. So since to add it to our HTML page, we have to use an opening and a closing style tag. And you can see that on line 20 and on line 23. And then all of our CSS rules get nested inside that tag. We don't use multiple style tags, we only use one, and then we just separate each CSS rule. And I'll demonstrate that. So let's go within here. We want to tab over one since it's nested inside the style sheet. And we're going to use a basic method of just a basic selector just by an element name. So if we were to target, for instance, the paragraphs on the page, the element name would be P, and then we open up our curly brackets, and then this is where we're going to put the property and the property value. So I mentioned color. This is for font color, and you'll become familiar. You'll see in the book, you'll become familiar with the different properties and how you correctly name them. But an easy way to add color is just typing the color name. And there's certain colors, or several that are referenced or acknowledged by the browsers. And again, there's hexadecimal ways to add color, and we'll be looking more at that. But a basic, just changing the color of the paragraph elements. If I were to save this inside of these style tags, and I were to refresh my page, you'll notice that all of the paragraphs on the page are now red. I've adjusted that color by using embedded CSS. Now, keep in mind, one thing you'll notice as well, that by using just the element name, it's targeting every single one on the page. So it's not very specific, but we'll go more into detail on that. Now, also I mentioned that you can add more than one CSS rule. So you can go add really as many as you wanted. If I were to target, let's say, let's target the article element. So if I start typing article, my curly braces, I open that up. Let's change that color to something else. Don't forget my semicolon. I can also add more than one property and property value inside the curly braces. We don't just need to do one. So any styles that we want to add for the article, we just line them up. As long as you end your declaration with the semicolon, you can add a new property and new property value. So let's add a background color. I'm going to show you an example of a hex decimal code. Actually, let's use... So the hex decimal code starts with a hashtag or a pound sign, and then a 3-digit number, or 6 digits, or 3 digits for short. So if we come over here and we refresh this page, it's given the entire article a background color, and then it's applied that aqua color to everything inside the article. If we look at the structure, there's elements in this particular example. There are elements nested inside the article. So the article is an example of a structural element that we can add other content to inside. But you'll notice that it didn't apply it to the paragraph, and that's because we have another style that's overriding it. So if we look up top here, when the browser renders this code, it's going to apply the paragraph style and then the article style. And so because we've applied a style to the paragraphs already, it's going to override this one for the article. So these are called descendant elements, and you do need to keep that in mind when you're applying styles. That's an example of really by relationship how that style is being applied. But again, I don't want to go in too much into detail on that right now. So let's look at the next method. This is the external method for adding CSS styles, and it's the most preferred because it does separate, like I mentioned, the structure and the presentation. It gives you one file that you can come in here and put all your styles to. You will sometimes, in the more complex code, there will be additional style sheets that you're working with, but in this case we have just 2 pages, and I can add a section here. Take note of the syntax for the comments. These are not rendered, these are just CSS comments, but you use those to kind of organize your code. So in this instance, I've added a note. This is the home page styles, and I'm going to use this as an example of external CSS. So it's the same method. If we wanted to just start by using an element type, let's look what we have on our page here. Let's say that we wanted to, let's target this H2 element within the article, or let's target all the H2s. I think by looking at it, I only have one H2 element, but it would be the same process. If I didn't want to be any more specific, I was just going to use the type name. I would type the selector as H2, and then we need to give it a property value. So let's do one for size. So let's say I wanted to make it really large. Usually by using your heading elements, the default heading sizes would be what you'd want to go with, but this is strictly for just demonstrating different property and property values. Let's also give it a color of Dodger blue, and we could just go on the line, down the line. We could add as many property and property values as we wanted. I'm going to save this and go over and see if anything happens. You'll notice, which let's identify where this H2 is, or what it's saying here. Down here, Grandma's chocolate chip cookies and cake, or cookie cake. If we look at our page as to where that's at, it's this H2 right here. If we didn't know, we could use our inspector tool and hover over it, but nothing's happened. And the reason that is because we have the code over here in this external file, and there's nothing that I've done so far to link the two together so they're communicating. And so this is a very important step when you're using external, that you have to link it together. And that's done in the head element. It's not done within the body. It's not something you'd want to display on the page. It's up here within the head element. So I've already added a note here on line 16. So I'm just going to tab over. It would line up with all the other elements here, and it's simply the word link. If I tab, it opens up the element with this REL that just establishes as a style sheet, and then the href, as we know, is where the resource is located. We're going to use a relative link, and that is a link that is located within our web project directory. And so it starts at the root level, and you might think that you would just start typing styles.css. However, since we're in the root and I've created another directory to put my style sheet in, we have to tell it to go look there. It has to go one level deeper into the CSS directory, and I can simply just start typing that directory name. My IntelliSense comes up, I can hit tab, and then it's going to list the files in that directory. I can hit tab again, and we now have the proper relative link for that style sheet. And if I've done it correctly, and I go over and refresh, we should see a change. And so actually it was this one up here. I was thinking it was down here, but so now we have the font size. Or let's see, what did we add on the styles on that one? So we changed the color and yes, the font size. And so that now applies. And so you always want to, when you set up an external style sheet, just to save yourself some headaches, is change the background color to red or do some kind of easy quick style to make sure it is applied. Refresh your browser to make sure it went through so you can save yourself a headache, because if you start adding in a bunch of code in here and you're thinking you've done something wrong down here when really it's only the link that you need to fix, it can save you a lot of time and headache. So that's the second type. This is the most, like I said, best practice, the one that on any project that I give you, this is the type of method that you're going to want to use. When I refer to external in the project requirements, that's what I'm referring to. The book a lot of times will have you, especially in the beginning when they're just trying to get you to practice some of the property and property values, for ease of use, they will have you use the style. This is the embed. And then the second to last one I'm going to mention is Inline CSS. So if we look at our page, it's looking kind of hideous here, but we have a way that we can add what's called Inline CSS. And the way that you do that is you actually go within the HTML element, the starting tag, which here, let me see what I might want to target. Let's target this H1 up here at the very top. If I were to use the inline method, I would actually come down here to line 34 where this H1 tag is. I would bring my cursor within the opening tag, and I would just use the style attribute. And an attribute, again, the IntelliSense is kicking in. I can hit tab. The syntax for an attribute is always the attribute name, an equal sign, and then double quotes, and you put your values for the attribute within the quotation marks. And so the only thing, since we already have the selector identified, the only portion you need to include for inline CSS is the property and the property value. So again, an easy one for this. Color. Let's see, I'm running out of color options here. Let's go with yellow. I have to end it with my semicolon, and if I hit save and we go over and refresh the page, it has now been turned yellow. Now that has no background contrast, so you can't really see it. So I want to add another property and property value. I need to come right in here within the same quotation marks, and I can add another property, which I'm going to go with background. You notice that my IntelliSense is kicking in here. I'm going to make it black because that'll give me some great contrast. I'm going to give it a little padding because now that we're giving it a background color, let's just do 0.5 em for now, which I mentioned is the padding is the spacing of an element inside any kind of border. So let's save that. I come over here. So I've got that little bit of spacing around it. It's the yellow color with the black background. Now this is the absolute worst method that you'd want to use, and you can kind of see why just based on if we started adding in a bunch of code, there's not much room here. If we were to be using different methods such as some CSS in our external style sheet, some embedded within the head, and then some inline, that's just a nightmare to kind of try to keep track of. So last method that you'd want to use. However, if I were to come down here, let's come down here to this paragraph. I'm going to use another inline. I just want to use this to illustrate. Let me do purple. See if that's going to work. Okay, so I've added another inline style here. This is the first paragraph within the article. If I save that and I come over here and refresh, you can see that it did target that. So it's very specific to that element. Now if we hit the F12 to bring up the developer tools, you can see that to kind of track down what's going on with these styles, we have to use our inspector tool. So the inspector tool, of course, we can also right click on an element and choose inspect, but we want our developer tool window to be open. So if I hit that inspector and I come over here, and if I forgot that I put that purple color in there, which would be easy to do when you're doing inline, and I hover over it and I click on it, it's showing over here on the right. It shows that this element.style that's always listed at the very top, that is for any kind of inline style. That is your clue that if your style, your code that you see is listed in this area, that you would have to go track it down inside the element itself, and sure enough, it's there. Now you'll also remember that in our embed that we had this paragraph with the property and property value to change the color to red. If you notice over here on the right, it tells us that it's located on the index.html page, and so we know if it's on that page that it's embedded code. So we'd have to come back over here and go up to our head element, and sure enough, within a style element we have that paragraph color turned to red. Now the reason that it has a line through it is because inline is more specific. It's going to be rendered last, and so it's going to override anything with less importance. And so kind of the rule or order of operation is that it's going to look at external first, then it's going to go look for any embedded code, and then it's going to do inline. So over here on our style sheet, if I were to come in here and add another CSS rule, and you just add as many as you want, you just need to make sure that once you close the curly bracket, you're ready for a new CSS rule declaration. But let's say we did color of, I am seriously running out of colors here. How about fuchsia? That's a bright one. So if I were to come over here and add a paragraph style for that, and then we go over and we refresh this page, you'll notice that there's a third block down here that now says there's this fuchsia color that's being applied, but it's also being overwritten. So again, as I mentioned, it's going to first look externally. Since there's one here embedded, it would then this one would take precedence, and then last, because we've applied a purple here, it's going to take the highest precedence. So that's kind of how it works, just a way for you to start understanding the different ways that you can add it and kind of their level of importance. So again, I'll always harp on you, external is the best practice. So just adding in that link, putting all your styles and organizing them together is going to be your very best method that you want to use as a web developer. So for this video, that's all I'm going to cover. If you have any questions, please let me know.